Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Sam.
I'm Achol.
Tomorrow is 1 week since Americans overwhelmingly elected Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States, sending him back to the White House with party control of Congress, as well as decisive victories in all 7 swing states. As the world's governments process what a Trump presidency could mean for them, much of the attention has turned to the impact of Trump's suite of economic reforms. On today's podcast, we're going to look at how changes in the global economy could impact us here in Australia and why crypto and shares have rocketed up on the news of Trump's return.
Now, Sam, there's been a lot of conversation about how Trump's economic policies will impact not only Americans, but us here in Australia.
Wait, pause. Firstly, welcome to the podcast, Achol. It's so good to have you on for the first time. Please continue.
So excited to be on my first pod. Let's get into it. So I think we feel like we're meant to know how a change in US economic policies could change the world, but it becomes a lot harder to explain what it actually means. So can you break it down for us?
Yeah, sure. And I think you're 100% right that it's one thing to know that a Trump presidency will make the economy different all around the world. It's another thing to understand why. It can be pretty confusing, and I think the easiest way to have this discussion would be to break it up into 3 key areas. And I know we love, a little language technique here at TDA, so let's think about it as 3 T's: taxes, tariffs, and tech.
Let's start with the first and probably the most familiar to people, taxes. Now, Trump wants to cut corporate taxes, right?
Yeah, and we don't really know too much about exactly how that's going to happen. He just got elected. He's still in the process of appointing key personnel into his office. We don't have firm policies yet. But it is possible that Trump could lower corporate tax rates from 21%, which it is now, to 15%. So the current corporate tax rate was actually signed into law by Trump the last time he was president. He brought it down from 30%. And this time around, Trump has what he describes as the America First agenda. And I'm going to repeat that phrase a lot in this episode. And the idea here is that if Trump lowers tax rates for big corporations in America, they're going to be more tempted to keep their operations in the US because it's going to be cheaper for them than if they move everything overseas. What that means is that more Americans could get jobs and more stuff will have the Made in America label on it. Now, you have to remember this corporate tax policy would only apply to companies that, quote, make their products in America, which is a further enticement to these corporations to actually do the building on United States soil. So I want to play this out for a bit of an example with you. Let's pick a random company, nothing to do with Donald Trump. Let's say Tesla and Elon Musk.
Of course.
Tesla need to make computer chips to put in an electric vehicle, and currently they might do that in somewhere like China or Taiwan because it's cheaper to do it than it is in the US. But if they don't have to pay as much corporations tax, they might want to move the computer chip production plan to a factory in, let's say, Texas, which means that they would hire more American workers and they'd keep everything within the US economy.
So that's the major appeal for Americans who are worried about their economy, right? That it would bring more jobs back to the US. But what are some of the concerns around it?
You're right. So for, somebody who's out of work, this is a great opportunity to try and get a manufacturing job, for example, that they might not have available to them right now. But you have to remember that federal governments collect taxes as a way to finance their responsibilities. So they pay for things like infrastructure or welfare payments or even hosting a major event like the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles through the tax they collect. And because the US government will, under this potential new Trump policy, collect less money via corporate taxes and a range of a whole other tax cuts they've got planned for individuals, they're going to have less money coming into their bank account. And what that means is that if they spend more than they are bringing in, they're going to go into debt. And a debt for a government could be very bad. And some economists have estimated that these tax cuts are going to result in a 7.5 trillion, with a T, US dollars worth of debt over the next 10 years.
So if lowering taxes will cause the US government to go into as much debt as you say they will, how did Trump respond to that?
Well, it was obviously put to him throughout the entire election. He couldn't run away from the point that lower taxes means less money coming into the government. But the big way he says he's going to solve that is the second T, and that's tariffs.
Okay, I've heard this word a lot. You have to explain what that means.
It's simple. It's just a tax placed on imported goods and services. And it can often be categorized by where the good or service is coming from. So say a tariff on all imports from Russia, or the type of item it is. So say a tariff on all imported red wine. Russia is a good example because tariffs in that case and in many other cases can be applied for political reasons, restricting a country's business as a way of trying to deter its government from doing certain things. So in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The US applied high tariffs to Russian goods as a way to kind of express their political opposition to that. And so Trump has said he wants to put a 60% tariff on goods that come from China. So right now, let's play, I know you love a shop. Let's play it out with Urban Outfitters. It costs $10 for Urban Outfitters, a US company, to import a t-shirt. And then they sell it to consumers for $20 and they make their $10 profit. Now, under this system with tariffs, if there was a 60% tariffs on all goods imported from China, Urban Outfitters have to pay $10 to import the good because they're paying that to the Chinese manufacturer. And then they have to pay $6 to the US government when it hits US land. So if they sell it to consumers for $20, they're only going to make $4 now because $10 from the Chinese importers and $6 to the government, that's $16 to get it on the shelf. And so what are they going to do? They're probably going to put the price of the t-shirt up to say $26 so they can still make the $10 profit they want to make.
So just to clarify, it's the US companies that will be paying the tariffs, not the Chinese.
Exactly. And I find that this is often a misconception when we're talking about tariffs, is it's costs that are going to have to be borne by the overseas country or the overseas manufacturing entity. No, it's the American company. So honestly, think of tariffs as somebody stamping a ticket on your way onto the train. The people at the US Coast Guard or customs authorities are applying the tariff to the US company when it hits the shores. And Trump's Democratic rival, Kamala Harris, she and other critics of Trump's economic policies, they tried to make this point that the cost of tariffs are going to be worn by US families because that t-shirt got more expensive, not by the Chinese companies they're targeted at. But it's not quite that simple. It does still impact those companies in a kind of a less direct way. So I'll give you a local example. China applied high tariffs on a range of Australian goods during tensions around COVID in the former Morrison government. And that made it difficult for Australian winemakers to sell their wines into China because the price of their product was so much higher for your average customer in mainland China. And so what Trump is hoping for here is that a company like Urban Outfitters are not going to be as keen to get their t-shirts from China because it costs them $16, including a tariff. And they might elect to make the t-shirts in the US for $13, so still more than they would have previously from China, but still not as much as the tariff. And they don't have to pay a tariff. And that's, again, this made in America idea.
So can you explain to us what that means for us here in Australia?
Well, let's say that Chinese t-shirt making company was about to build a factory, or they were about to buy a new t-shirt making machine because they were excited about the idea of expanding their business of exporting t-shirts to the US. Now, they're a little bit worried about that, and they're a little bit worried about keeping Urban Outfitters happy because of this new tariff that Urban Outfitters are going to have to pay on t-shirts when they arrive. So the Chinese company might hold off on building the factory. It might hold off on upgrading the machine, and they cancel an order of steel or extra coal or natural gas or petrol that they were going to use to power their factories. Now, where's the steel or coal or gas or petrol going to come from? It could come from, in fact, it's likely to come from Australia.
And all those things you just mentioned are pretty big exports for us, right?
Well, it's a major part of our export puzzle. So iron ore, steel, accounts for 20.3% of our entire export load.
Wow.
And the idea here is that if there's less demand for the big ticket items, so steel, gas, coal, that we export to places like China, our economy is going to shrink. Our government's going to collect less tax because those companies that pay their corporations tax to the Australian government are going to be making less stuff. And suddenly we're feeling the pinch of all of this. And in fact, the OECD, this big global economic body, they said that tariffs on China could drop Australia's GDP by 1.2%, and it would make us the second hardest hit economy in the world in that scenario. And that's really going to hurt.
Ouch. Okay, Sam, I've been hearing a lot about this term called a trade war. And from what I understand, it's not a boots on the ground type of war.
Yeah.
So what are they referring to?
Well, it's just what we've been talking about. It's the way that economists describe the use of tariffs by Trump to try and keep jobs in the US, but also simultaneously harm the Chinese economy. I think that's an important point because he sees China as a threat to America's standing as the most powerful country in the world.
Well, that was a lot of information, but I think the one thing that's important to remember is that it's still early days and Trump hasn't even made it into the White House yet. So Officially. So it will be something to keep an eye on. And finally, just before we wrap up, the final T, technology. Tell us all about it.
Well, this is the one that's kind of a little bit more upbeat to those of us who might have crypto or shares, because that big last T of technology is a really good thing for those who have money in the market. It's been a pretty good week for them since Trump was elected. So take Bitcoin, for example. That's hit a new record high and is now up 80% in 2024. And there's a pretty simple reason for this. The tech industry and the crypto industry and a lot of major publicly listed companies, they all believe Trump is going to be a president that implements policies that are favorable to them. So Trump himself has financial stakes in a number of crypto assets. He's got people around him like Elon Musk who also have large financial interests in that space. In fact, in August, Trump said crypto could define the future and he wants it mined, minted and made in the USA. And again, we see this pattern emerging. He's even suggested that the US government buys a bunch of Bitcoin for a backup fund in case of a major global conflict. So obviously, if the US government does that, Bitcoin is only going to keep going up and up.
Wow. So basically, the ones with portfolios are throwing parties right now. But how sustainable is this growth?
Well, this is the big question for those with portfolios, but also people who study economies all around the world is, there's been this big kind of, you'd almost call it a sugar hit since Donald Trump won the election. Will it continue? We don't know. And we aren't in the habit of giving out financial advice here at TDA. We have no idea what the future has in store. But you do have to remember that just as quickly as the financial markets like crypto or the stock market can go up, as they have in the last week, they can also come down just as fast. And as we've chatted through today, the way that financial markets move is extremely complex. It's not just based on one vote in one election. They can be responsive to anything from tariffs to global conflicts, things like a global pandemic, which can't be predicted, and everything in between. So really the only advice I can give you with certainty is to strap yourself in.
So I can understand why all of this would mean major changes for those in the US, but how does that impact us here?
Well, I want to try and kind of bring all the three T's together. So we had taxes, tariffs, and technology. Mm-hmm. If we bring all of that together, if the combination of corporate and individual tax cuts happen, if there are tariffs implemented, if we do keep seeing a boom in technology, it could likely drive up prices of everyday items in the US. And the idea here is that the more money that Americans have in their pockets because their tax rates are lower, the more money that they have to spend on goods and services, and that's demand. And when demand increases, the supply, so how many of those goods and services there are available, is constrained. And that means businesses can put up prices on what they offer. That means prices could rise, and that's where we start to see that big word inflation start creeping in. Now, over the last couple of years, we've seen the impacts of inflation all around the world, and here at home, we've also seen how governments and central banks kind of respond to control it. And that's basically controlling interest rates, so putting up interest rates to try and slow the rate of inflation. I think a really helpful example is to look at the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Now, that was a US housing issue organically. But that ended up affecting every major economy all around the world. And I'd probably say that in the 15 years since then, our economy and our world has probably gotten more globalized and more unified in this way, especially economically. So we're really going to feel the ripples of whichever way the US economy moves.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that to us,
Thanks.
Sam. And thank you for listening. We'll be back again tomorrow.